So, we need nerves. Yeah, should, but so now we should be as well recording from this camera. And Theresia, thanks very much.
So, good evening also from my side. Thanks a lot for the very nice introduction, and thanks a lot for the invitation to Professor Griessler and also to the team of the Austrian Cultural Forum. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure also that we can meet in person. This is not just a virtual meeting room, but a real meeting room where we can discuss together the Western Balkans path towards EU membership, new drive or dead end. And I think indeed it's a very topical question to discuss in the context of Russian aggression towards Ukraine. You might have heard the German Chancellor. He said that this is a Zeitenwende. I looked up the English word for it, and now it doesn't come to my mind. A watershed moment. That's it. A watershed moment where nothing will be as it was before. And I think among the many things that are actually changing, that have changed overnight with February 24, is that suddenly there is a very high awareness within the European Union, and in particular in the western parts of the European Union, that Europe does not only consist of the EU, and that there's countries in the east and in the southeast of Europe that are not yet members of the European Union. And of course, currently the focus is on Ukraine, very, very rightfully so. But the focus is also more generally on those countries that might join the European Union. So for the Western Balkans, there is one keyword that has been that has been out there. The German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, when she visited the region last week, she said that this is a wake-up call for us regarding the strategic importance of the Western Balkans. The same word was used by the High Representative Josep Borrell when he visited Albania recently. He said it's a wake-up call for Europe. I'm not sure if they have agreed actually on whether they will use this word, but it's not only experts now talking about a wake-up call, but really also the politically responsible people. So if we might be a little bit sarcastic, one could ask, okay, a wake-up call, does it mean that the EU has been sleeping before? And I think we have to ask indeed a few very disagreeable questions. So why is it that 2 decades after the start of the accession process for the Western Balkans, and actually 3 decades after the dissolution of Yugoslavia, we still have open conflicts that have not been resolved to this day? Could the EU actually have done more to solve these conflicts? Could the EU generally have done more to anchor the Western Balkans more firmly in the European Union? So we might also have less fears today about Russia acting as a spoiler in the region, in particular in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So in my presentation, I would actually like to first of all start to have a look at the state of play of EU integration in Western Balkans. And I will actually argue that the accession perspective for the region is today more remote than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And in the main part, I would actually like to ask how the EU comes into this whole picture. And I would like to do this by pointing to 3 dilemmas or goal conflicts that the EU has been facing in the Western Balkans throughout the whole accession process, and that I think will become even more salient now with Russia's aggression towards Ukraine. By this, I do by no means want to somehow justify or maybe even apologize EU action or maybe rather also EU inaction in the region over the past decade. But I think it's important for us to have a look at these dilemmas, to also better understand the certain constraints that the EU is facing in the region. And this will also allow us to ask the question on how to overcome these dilemmas, what could be possible ways forward. And for this last part, I'm also really counting on your support, and that we can discuss this also together. I also wanted to say before we get started that tonight I'm not speaking to you as a political scientist, so I will not bring to the table different theories of international relations and so on, but I'm talking to you as a practitioner who has been following EU enlargement policy for 12 years now, and I would like to share empirical observations with you. Before we get started, I would actually like to conduct a little opinion poll here in the room. So it's not representative, it's not anonymous, and you can participate by showing your hands. So the question is, how many of the 6 countries of the Western Balkans will join the European Union within the next 5 years? So you can raise your hand, you can show the number of countries, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 0. And we can start now. Everyone who wants to participate can raise their hands. Okay, so, okay. This is, okay. So I see a lot of zeros here. 1, 2, 2. 1, 1, okay, 5, okay, 0, 0. Interesting, very interesting. I'll ask you later which country you meant. Okay, I would like to ask you the same question again, but with a time horizon of 10 years. So how many countries are going to join within the next 10 years? You can show your hands. Okay, we have 4, 1, 2, 3. 3, okay, 5. Is this a 0 or yes, 0? 4 as well. Okay, so I see we have like more optimism here in the room when it comes to the more medium to long-term perspective. Here you can also see what the citizens in the Western Balkans actually replied to this question in a poll conducted last autumn. So you can see that we actually have quite some EU enthusiasm in particular, or rather optimism in Montenegro and in Kosovo actually. So that's the blue ones here. Then when it comes to the 10-year perspective, we have still around like 1/4 to 1/3 of the people thinking that it's going to happen within the next 10 years. And what I found personally quite striking is that we also have the most negative opinions actually in Serbia and in okay, what do I have to click in order not to I'm gonna try this. Yeah, okay, perfect. In Serbia and in North Macedonia. So here you have 44% and 34% respectively who think that their countries are actually never going to join the European Union. So, state of play, where do the Western Balkans stand in their EU accession process? And the way you can answer this question depends very much what you look at. So whether you look at the formal integration process or whether you look on actual developments on the ground. So when we look at the formal process, starting with the signing of the Stabilization and Association Agreement, all the way up to accession, it doesn't look that bad actually. One could say that the glass is rather half full. So as you know, Croatia already joined the EU in 2013 and thus left the Western Balkans group. So Croatia could actually leave the Western Balkans because the Western Balkans is not a geographical notion, but it's a political notion that has been coined by the European Union. So that's why it's possible for them to leave the Western Balkans to the European Union. So we have actually 6 more countries to deal with, and we can roughly divide them in 3 informal groups. So we have the front runners, Montenegro and Serbia. Then we have the second-tier countries, Albania and Macedonia. And then we have the third-tier countries, who have been engaged in accession negotiations for quite a long time right now. Then we do have the patient candidates, I would call them, North Macedonia and Albania. And they both have had a recommendation of the European Commission for quite some time. So Albania got the recommendation in 2018, and North Macedonia got the recommendation in 2009. But could obviously not open accession negotiations because of the name dispute with Greece. And once the name dispute with Greece was overcome, and after the French episode, about which we're going to talk later, now we have Bulgaria blocking the opening of accession negotiations with North Macedonia due to identity issues, and also holding hostage the Albanian accession negotiations, actually. And then we have two countries clearly lagging behind, Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo, and that's also the countries who do have issues with their statehood. We're going to talk about it also later, which actually makes it very difficult for them to advance on the accession process. So when we look at the formal process, we could say, well, there's blockades, there's not a lot of dynamics, but still the countries are on the path towards the European Union. However, when we look I would argue that despite this formal progress, the EU perspective for the Western Balkans today is actually a more remote one than it was 5 years ago or even 10 years ago. And this is due to two main factors. One factor has to be found in the growing enlargement skepticism, also indifference towards enlargement, at least until February 24, by different EU member states. And this enlargement skepticism can actually be explained by various factors. So, of course, one big factor is that the European Union has been very focused over the past decade and a half in solving the multiple crises it had within the European Union. But there's also the perception that the countries who joined the EU in 2004, in 2007, and in 2013 have not been that well prepared in terms of rule of law, or they were well prepared but have experienced democratic backsliding. That is a lot, discussed a lot these days. And then we also have a skepticism towards the current accession candidates, and in many EU capitals there is this question whether there's really the capacity, and in particular also the willingness to engage in meaningful reforms towards EU accession. And the second main factor are developments on the ground, which are of course closely intertwined with these perceptions that we find within the European Union. So I'll just do a very quick tour. One thing that has been discussed a lot is democratic backsliding in the region. Here you have the Freedom House democracy score that clearly shows a downward trend for all the countries, so also the front runners, Serbia, Montenegro, with one exception of North Macedonia. So for North Macedonia in yellow here, you see that it's the only country that really moved up in this democracy score. And this also means that by now, no country in the Western Balkans, or also not Serbia and Montenegro, are considered as democracies, but they're considered as hybrid regimes, also together with Hungary. So you also see Hungary here in green, also with a very steep downward trend. Add to this worsening security situation. So I've already mentioned in the beginning that we have unresolved issues that are heritage of the dissolution of Yugoslavia, and we see in Bosnia and Herzegovina that the crisis is actually worsening. We see the leader of Republika Srpska, Milorad Dodik, openly threatening with secession, and also taking steps, concrete steps into this direction. We have the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue that is actually stalling. And we've seen, for instance, in autumn last year, also pretty dangerous situation on the ground when the conflict on the number plates was escalating. So I've also mentioned here actually the resolution of the name dispute between North Macedonia and Greece, because that's also good news. That's a positive development that we have to take into account. But more generally speaking, when you look at the state of good neighborly relations, one might rather speak of bad neighborly relations, actually. So relations between neighbors that are characterized by rise in nationalist rhetorics, a rise in identity politics that is also conducted at the sacrifice of the neighbors as well. The socioeconomic situation is a dire one, and this has already been the case even before the outbreak of the pandemic. And the countries of the region have also been severely affected by the pandemic. So I will not go into details here. It's rather to complete the picture. But despite, or maybe also because of these negative developments, we still see in the region very high support of EU membership. So here you can see that in particular, Albania and Kosovo are very enthusiastic about EU membership, so their populations. And the country that has by far the most skeptic enlargement or membership polls are Serbia. So you have only a little more than half of the population who says that they are in favor of Serbia joining the European Union. And I think that this is in part also due to the capture of the media environment in Serbia. I think it can partly be explained by that as well, that we see the effects now. On the one hand, we have very high, we have the EU actually that is really considered as an attractive destination for the countries of the Western Balkans. But on the other hand, I think what got really lost in the past years, because the process has been so long, because it did not really positively affect the life of citizens, that actually people don't believe that EU membership is really realistic for them, as we've seen in the polls above, or they think that actually it's not going to have a positive impact on their life. So they don't really believe into the transformative power of the European Union in the Western Balkans. And one consequence of this is that we have very high numbers of migration. So it's very difficult actually to get reliable numbers on migration. Here we have Eurostat statistics on the first permits of, it's not first permits of residence, but first permits of work. So I apologize, it's not correctly displayed here. So these are the first permits of work that were granted to citizens from the Western Balkans. You can see that the numbers have fallen in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but generally they're very high. So for instance, when you look at Serbia here at the very right, in 2019 we had European Union come in here with its policies. I would like to speak about three dilemmas of which I think that they have really shaped the EU's enlargement policy in the past decades, but also in the past years. And I would like to start with classical dilemma, so to say, which is stabilization versus political transformation, or stabilization versus democratization, we could also say. And this has been inherent to the accession process from its very beginning, 22 years ago, actually. So the EU has declared two big goals why it offers a membership perspective to the Western Balkans. And the first of these goals is political and economic transformation. So this is something that we're familiar with already from the enlargement towards Central and Eastern Europe. Accordingly, we also have the same criteria that are in place, the so-called Copenhagen Criteria, that were originally designed for the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. I think it's really interesting to have a short look at these criteria in the current context of other European states such as Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, actually asking for accession, and also in the context of democratic backsliding, both in the Western Balkans, but also within the European Union. I just see that they're in German, so I apologize for that. But I'm sure you're also familiar with them. So we have the first group, which are the political criteria, which means that a country that wants to join the European Union actually needs stable institutions that ensure the respect of democracy, the rule of law, of human rights and minority rights. The second criteria are the economic criteria. So the country needs a functioning market economy, which allows it to actually resist the competitive pressure and also the market forces within the European Union. And then we have the third set of criteria, which is maybe the most comprehensive one, which is that a country that wants to join the EU needs to adopt the whole set of rules and laws, the so-called acquis communautaire. So last time I checked, the acquis communautaire was about 130,000 pages. So you can imagine how long it takes actually to really transpose this whole acquis communautaire into the national law. We have the Copenhagen Criteria on the one hand, but the EU has also defined additional criteria for the Western Balkans, and these relate to this goal of stabilization and to the heritage of the wars in the 1990s. They're sometimes referred to as Copenhagen Plus. So here we have the buzzwords that we hear a lot: regional cooperation, good neighborly relations, protection of minorities, cooperation with the ICTY, which actually was a very big issue for certain states, in particular Serbia, in the accession process until a few years ago. And also the compliance with the agreements that were concluded. So very topical, the Dayton Agreement, the Ohrid Framework Agreement, but also the so-called normalization of relations with Serbia and Kosovo is since 2011 part of the accession conditionality. So in 2011, the then Chancellor Angela Merkel actually insisted that this is included as part of the accession conditionality. And we also find it today in the accession framework, in the negotiations framework with Serbia. So we have actually these two goals of EU association, which are stabilization on the one hand and political and economic transformation on the other hand. And theoretically speaking, in the concept of the European Union, these goals should actually go together very well. So countries that can overcome open conflicts are then also able to move faster towards the EU to conduct reform. And then on the other hand, countries that are more transformed should also be more stable. But I think what we've really seen in the past years is that it's the other way around, that actually these open stability issues are blocking effective political transformation. And this is particularly true for Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia and Kosovo. In Bosnia, we have contested statehood, where the existence of the state is actually contested from within. In Kosovo, it's actually contested from the outside. But in both cases, it leads to the fact that the countries cannot really build functioning institutions, cannot really focus on conducting these reforms, adopting the Copenhagen Criteria, that, as we have seen, are very demanding and very comprehensive. Why do I think this is we have a goal conflict here? So in the past years, actually, but actually from the very beginning, we have, for instance, seen the second country that concluded a stabilization and association agreement with the EU was North Macedonia in 2001. So 2001 was the year when we had a conflict between the Macedonian security forces and the Albanian rebels that could fortunately be ended, that could be resolved. But the conclusion of the stabilization and association agreement was actually part of the stabilization efforts. So it was a reward for creating stability, actually. And also today, we see, for instance, that we have serious democratic backsliding in Serbia. So you've seen the downward development before. And the question is, what did the European Union do? So did they call out on Serbia the democratic backsliding? Did they suspend accession negotiations, which would actually be possible in the negotiations framework according to the overall balance clause? They did actually none of this. And the reason why many analysts say is that the EU actually needs the Serbian President Vučić on the Kosovo issue. So he set out to solve this conflict, and the EU. The EU needs him on this. The EU needs him to be a factor of stability in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and hence the pressure on Serbia with regard to this democratic backsliding has been very, very low. You might have also heard this term hypocrisy, which has been shaped by the BPAC group, and which actually describes the EU's choice to foster short-term stability in the region with this kind of policies, but then to renounce a more long-term democratization. So this is the first dilemma, which I said has been there from the beginning. The second dilemma is a rather new one. So this is a dilemma between geopolitical considerations and political transformation. And it comes from the fact that other external actors, such as Russia and China, but also Turkey or the Gulf states, have gained more and more influence in the region over the past years. And it also comes in this context of geopolitics, of great power politics being back to the table, and actually the rules-based world order, as it's actually pursued by the European Union, by the West, is actually on the decline, as we unfortunately currently see very in a very direct way. So to these two original goals, why the EU offers an accession perspective to the Western Balkans, we have to add a third goal, and this is to restrain the influence of other actors in the region. So this influence of other actors is actually quite manifold. There has been a lot of talk about China's infrastructure projects under the Belt and Road Initiative. I brought one example here because we are in Budapest today. So the railway, or one part of the railway line, has just been opened between Budapest and Belgrade. And at this occasion, the Serbian president, also said that our high-speed railways were built by Chinese and Russian friends that built the future of our country together with us. Besides infrastructure projects, Chinese influence has become particularly visible throughout the coronavirus pandemic. And here, Serbia has also been a prime example of Chinese mask diplomacy. So you might remember the statement by Alexander Vučić in March 2020, so in the very early days of the pandemic. And after the EU introduced export restrictions on protective medical equipment, he reacted by saying, I quote here, "European solidarity does not exist. It was a fairy tale on paper. I have sent a special letter to the only ones who can help, and that is China." And 1 week later, at Belgrade Airport, Chinese medical equipment and also medical staff arrived at Belgrade Airport, and they were greeted by the president himself.
Though China hasn't finished the fight against coronavirus yet, they say they will help Serbia, like iron brothers. Serbian people will never forget this kindness. China is an old friend and will continue to be for generations to come. They have shown to be our friend in need. We know how to return this kindness. If they have difficulties one day, apart from love and respect, we will provide support that no one can match.
Okay, so very short. It wasn't very loud, but he actually said that they will stand together like iron brothers. And then there were also these billboards in Belgrade which said, "Thank you, brother G." Okay, genau, einfach hier. Okay, so what we are facing here is what Joseph Borrell called the battle of narratives. We see that there's a discrepancy between the facts on the one hand and the narrative and the perceptions created by these narratives on the other hand. Because in fact, the European Union has by far provided the biggest volume of financial aid to the region in the COVID-19 pandemic. So you can see here the Western Balkans are in turquoise. And we had until April 2021 nearly 6 billion euros that were provided to the region. It's also interesting when you look, for instance, at the whole of sub-Saharan Africa that only received 2 billion more than the Western Balkans. So we see that geographical closeness, the degree of association, is a very important factor that determines also the volume of financial aids, and also the fact that these aids were already planned before in the budget, because it's obviously not only additional fresh money that's provided here. What we see here is that the aid provided by the European Union actually lacks visibility. Or in other words, can you imagine the Serbian president kissing the European flag? It's a question whether we really want that, but still, I think it shows the difference. So the EU has been losing at least for the coronavirus pandemic. It has been losing on this battle of narratives. And I think that the awareness for the EU to improve its communication and its visibility in the Western Balkans is very, very high right now. The question is, why do I think we have a goal conflict here? Because theoretically, a political transformation towards democracy, towards the rule of law, would actually be the best instrument to protect the countries of the region of harmful external influence. So not all external influence is bad, obviously, but what we've seen actually is that for example, on infrastructure projects, the deals are struck in a backroom deal manner. So we have a lack of transparency, we have a lack of accountability. We do not know what's even written in the contracts. We also see that countries risk political dependency as well. When we consider, for instance, that Montenegro has 39% of its public debt with China, or North Macedonia has 20% of its public debt with China. So this opens, of course, also the doors for political influence. Or when we take into account that China is providing Serbia with surveillance technologies. So political transformation is important actually to have strong institutions that could actually act more independently of these external actors' influence. But still, I think in the short term, we're facing a goal conflict because these geopolitical considerations, they're actually requiring a fast integration into the European Union. And that also means that accession conditionality can potentially be watered down. Because when we speak about political transformation, it's a comprehensive process that could also slow down the accession process. And I think another reason is that the EU, in the face of this geopolitical competition, is also quite hesitant to confront strongmen of the region on the rule of law, because they're afraid that they will drive them into the arms of China, into the arms of Russia. And I think that this focus on geopolitical factors is only going to grow in the face of Russian adversity. So finally, the third dilemma is a classical one. It does not only concern EU enlargement policy, certainly, and it arises from the fact that we have, on the one hand, the EU strategic interests in the Western Balkans, and on the other hand, we do have member states that bring their domestic concerns into the EU's enlargement policy. So one very classical example of this that has been there for a long time are the bilateral veto issues that lead to member states vetoing certain candidate countries. The country that has been most affected by this is certainly North Macedonia. So North Macedonia has been blocked by Greece for a very long time due to the name dispute. And once this was over, we now have a blockade from Bulgaria, also due to issues referring to history, language, and so on. But we've also seen a pretty long blockade actually from Slovenia in the Croatian accession process. So this was about the border dispute on the Bay of Piran. And we've also seen Croatia blocking Serbia in 2016 for a few months. This was the chapter on, I think, education and culture as well. And the Croatian parliament, the Sabor, has actually passed a resolution when they joined the European Union, where they solemnly declared that they're not going to block other countries in the accession process. But I'm not so sure actually if it's not going to happen again, in particular on Serbia. these are the classical bilateral issues, but we also have domestic issues in certain member states that are actually playing into the accession process. So I've mentioned before that enlargement skepticism is very high. Both among decision makers in certain member states, but also in the public. As you may know, the most enlargement skeptical public that we have is in France, closely followed by Austria and by Germany. But when you look at opinion polls in France, so the French are not generally against new members joining the European Union. This is really directed against specifically states of the Western Balkans. We also have Ukraine here, and in particular against Turkey. But this study from which I have this poll is really interesting because it also shows that actually the issue for the most people in these polls does not have a high salience. So most people say that that other countries joining the EU is most likely not going to have an impact on their personal life. Still, we had actually France blocking the accession negotiations both with North Macedonia and with Albania since 2018. And so I think this clearly has to be seen also in the domestic context with European elections coming up in spring 2019. And they were actually afraid of the far right instrumentalizing this issue, linking it with fears of migration, and thus had clearly a domestic component in their action. But France gave its blockade actually a more strategic turn. So they said actually that before new members can join the EU, they want also institutional reforms within the European Union. And they also asked for the revision of the accession methodology, which actually was the case. So it was revised in 2020, and then France also gave up its blockade on Albania and North Macedonia. But what still remains is this demand to actually have this institutional reform, and we can also find this in the summit declaration of the Brdo summit in autumn last year, where it says that it's important that the EU can maintain and deepen its own development, ensuring its capacity to integrate new members. So we see a return here of the actually old debate of deepening versus widening, and of the issue of absorption capacity. On the one hand, I think it's a good thing in a way that the EU, even with 27 member states, would actually need some reforms to ensure better decision making when we think about introducing qualified majority voting in more areas. For instance, also in enlargement policy, that would also make the bilateral veto issue that I've been talking about less salient. But on the other hand, it's a problem because this is a condition on which the candidate countries have no influence at all. So this is something that the EU member states have to sort out. Well, it would be pretty unfair actually to block countries on their path because the EU says they are not ready, because they did not do their homework, to use a frequently used metaphor. So before I've been talking about member states blocking candidate countries because of bilateral issues, but I think we also see the opposite. We also see certain member states pushing certain candidates because of their domestic interest. And the prime example of this is actually Viktor Orban pushing Serbia's candidacy. So we've seen a lot of developments in this regard. We've also seen, for instance, allegations against the Commissioner for Enlargement and Neighborhood Policy, Oliver Vahey. So Politico reported that there's allegations that he's actually within the European Commission pushing Serbia's accession dossier. and that he's also trying to water down rule of law assessments of the Commission. This has met the resistance of the officials within the European Commission. And I think it's generally really an issue of concern, because the European Commission should be the one supranational instance that is actually really ensuring an objective stance and objective assessments. And this obviously is very harmful to its credibility. Okay. So to sum up these three dilemmas, we can say that we clearly have a discrepancy between the EU's aspirations in the region on the one hand, because when we look at the enlargement strategies, it's clearly a focus on the rule of law, and a focus on the implementation of the rule of law, and a focus on establishing a track record to really practically implement the rule of law. But when we look at policies on the ground, the focus has been clearly on stability and on geopolitical considerations. So what can we expect in the coming weeks and months? Personally, I think that this context of Russian adversity can be beneficial to the accession process, because we can expect from member states to actually get more serious on their accession offer, and this would actually be good news for candidates, because it would finally create an accession perspective that is more concrete and that is actually more tangible, which could also be an encouragement to really engage with the reforms demanded under the Copenhagen Criteria. And the second effect of this might be that member states would align more closely with the EU strategic interests. So this third dilemma I've been speaking about could actually be attenuated. I think generally what EU decision makers do not lack is actually analysis and awareness of what's going on. So there's a very high awareness of the problems of the process. They actually know, both in the Commission and the member states know, that they need to be more outspoken on democratic backsliding. They know that they need to speak to citizens more directly and confront the problems, the everyday problems of citizens. They know that they have a big communication problem. But what we have been lacking so far is really the EU translating this knowledge into concrete and systematic policies towards the region. So really asking, okay, what are the effects of our policies, and are we reaching our goals, and how can we adjust? And this, I think, this is also largely a question of political will, and it might be on the rise in the current context of the European security situation. Personally, I also think that this model of integration without transformation that could be pushed for geopolitical motives is actually not going to succeed. So it would mean that we would have countries that are not well reformed, that have autocratic tendencies, that are dependent on foreign actors within the European Union, and this would clearly be harmful to the EU's capacity to act, to the EU's rule of law agenda, and most of all, it would actually not really be a game changer for the citizens in the Western Balkans. I think a debate that we will have also in the next weeks and months is actually also the debate on staged accession, and I think it's also time for us to discuss whether this clear in and out model is still adequate, because now I've heard interesting numbers yesterday in a presentation that the economist Mario Holzner gave, in which he said that actually EU member states receive in structural funds, they receive 4 to 5% of their GDP, whereas the accession candidates receive currently with the pre-accession funds around 1% of the GDP. And this only changes once a country joins the European Union. So I think we really need to gradually adapt pre-accession aid, because it's actually needed now, also to foster the socio-economic development of the region. So I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. And I will stand if that's all right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm taking notes because usually I forget the questions and then I get all confused. So, so I'm happy to start with one. Yeah, it's obviously a big issue, and I think so far the strategy of member states, at least of the member states where enlargement is not popular, is actually to keep the issue under the radar. So that's also what German officials told us a few years ago when we conducted research interviews. It's really about let's not talk about it, and let's hope that nobody notices that we have this accession process going on. And I think one general problem we have is that there's also a lot of I like a better word than ignorance actually, but a lot of knowledge that is actually not there in the population. So I think in Austria, if you would go somewhere to the supermarket and you would ask people, can you tell me which countries have an accession perspective? And I think that many people even don't know if certain countries have joined the EU yet or not. So it's obviously an issue that is not of such a high importance for their everyday life, unless they want to travel there and so on. So I think one part of the solution is to obviously to talk about it, and also to actually reply to arguments, Islamophobia, as you mentioned it, Frauke, for instance. So not to shy away from this debate, and also to and I think this might be a good moment now, because we have a huge interest right now into Eastern and maybe also Southeast Europe, to generally include those countries more into our debates, because I think what we see is in the public opinion very often we have very stereotypical views, and not only in the population but also among decision makers. So the first thing when they hear, I'm not going to name a particular country now, but the first thing they would think about would be like, okay, it's corruption and war and instability. And countries that are not developed as ours. So I think it's also important to show actually the whole the whole aspects of these countries' complexities and also positive developments, civil society, and so on. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely, and I think that we should really not underestimate the stabilizing effect that this EU perspective has had on several countries on the region. So you mentioned North Macedonia, and I think you see the effects only once this perspective is getting weak and is fading. You see how it creates actually also conflicts within the societies. But when you think about Kosovo's declaration of independence in 2008, and Serbia's reaction, that was relatively moderate. And I would really tie this back to the fact that Serbia back then had a very concrete accession perspective, and also the whole political process was really oriented towards EU membership, which is definitely not the case anymore today. Today we rather have a situation where we hear a lot of EU bashing actually from the responsible politicians. So certainly the EU has a responsibility, and then I think also certain countries need to decide for themselves what's more important to them, whether they want to use the veto that they have because of the unanimous decision making in order to push their own agenda, to push their own national interests, or whether they're really interested in genuinely good neighborly relations that creates stability that's needed. Thanks. It's an interesting question. I do think that the Copenhagen criteria they should not be reformed, because basically they really define what makes up an EU member state, and also what makes up the EU's identity. So which is of course the single market, but which also is related to democracy and the rule of law. What's interesting is that not so much the Copenhagen criteria have changed from one enlargement to the other, but the fact that member states are now much more insisting that they actually also respected not only on paper but in practice. And so this is raising the bar. It raised the bar a little bit for Croatia, but it's raising the bar much more for the countries that are to fall into the European Union. But I think what's needed more is to have more interim incentives, because obviously until you really fulfill the Copenhagen criteria and establish a track record, as it's also foreseen by the accession process, this is going to take years. So we need ways to actually associate the countries of the Western Balkans more firmly with the EU. And as I said, by increasing financial aid, by integration into the single market, by having them participate in various EU institutions and programs, also with observer status. So to make sure that you don't get everything once you join, but that it's really a gradual integration that can happen.
Parties do not be for the enlargement of the Western Balkans. But as far as I see for Austria, for example, I mean, Austria is a population by the enlargement to Austria. But the government also, the Swedish party, was always, as far as I know it, pro-enlargement. The same for, I think, Germany. In Germany, which government is in power? Government for enlargement. And the country we didn't mention, of course, the Netherlands, but I call it French and Netherlands, who were asking for more demanding accession, what pushing countries, and not Austria or Germany. And then maybe cynical point. Finally, governments decide fostering a permanent population of as long as the governments are for enlargement, it's not such a big problem. It would be more a problem if the government is against the population for enlargement.
Yes, I understand what you're saying. So I think enlargement fatigue or skepticism is something. So you're absolutely right that the case of Austria, theoretically, the Austrian government would actually need to be against enlargement, but only considering public opinion. But it's not given the very close economic ties of Austria to the region, the geographic proximity, then the interest in stability and so on. So there's a few very good reasons why the Austrian government and also the German government nevertheless supports enlargement despite public opinion. But what we've seen, for instance, in not only in France, is that also decision makers are getting more skeptical. So, for instance, in Germany, traditionally you had not only the government, but the whole parliament, the whole parties represented in the Bundestag. They were all in favor of the Western Balkans enlargement. This has changed when AfD actually moved into the Bundestag. So you have rougher debates, definitely, but still a broad consensus among the other parties. But what we've seen, for instance, is so the German Bundestag has quite far-reaching competences because they have to be asked on the opening of accession negotiations with countries, and they had a huge debate on Serbia and Montenegro back then, because, for instance, within the Christian Democratic Union, the parliamentarians who were in charge of the issue had a really hard time to convince their fellow party colleagues who have not been working explicitly on EU policies or foreign policies, why Serbia should actually open accession negotiations, or why Montenegro should open accession negotiations. So you also had resistance within the own parties, generally, when you look at the Brdo summit, for instance, so for the final declaration, there was a discussion among member states in the council whether the word enlargement should even be mentioned in the declaration. So finally it made it into the declaration once, but it shows that really this whole consensus on EU enlargement is walking, or has been walking, on thin ice. If you happen to have just one country that says no, like France did for a certain while, then well, the whole basis of accession conditionality, which is the credible accession perspective, is actually gone. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think definitely can give more visibility to the enlargement issue. But I think I mean there have been also many demands by experts, by activists, that also the Western Balkans countries themselves should actually be included more firmly in the Conference on the Future of Europe, and that might also have contributed to this visibility. And personally, I don't understand why this has not been the case. I mean, it's like, you know, when you have a new boyfriend or your new girlfriend, and you don't want to present him or her to your family.
People mentioned the 4 powers definitely mentioned the US. Are the interests of the US, or how much US is connected with Balkans, think about, for example, Kosovo, and not necessarily coordinating with people and this has changed now from 5
Definitely, yes. So I think to start with the second question, I think that the differences in interests are much less now with the presidency of Joe Biden, obviously, because Donald Trump really had also his own agenda in the region with this awkward signing of a treaty of when he ordered actually the leaders of Kosovo and Serbia into the Oval Office, and it was kind of a parallel agreements where things were agreed that were actually covered under the EU mediation process. So there's definitely more coordination now. I think that the US are still want actually the Balkans to be primarily the EU's business, and that's also what the EU wants. I think there's a consensus there that the EU should lead, but where they definitely play a big role is in supporting Kosovo, and also the cause of Kosovo, and also they have been very active on infrastructure investments and economic initiatives in the region, because I think they have clearly identified this as a way to push other actors out, or at least have something that they can offer to the region as well. Yes. On Open Balkans, I don't really have a firm opinion. I think that generally what works well for the region is that when initiatives of regional cooperation are really integrated into the EU accession process. So when you integrate it into this framework of EU integration, well, I think the main difficulty is that we don't have all countries on board yet. So, but generally, I don't see any harmful effects of the Open Balkans initiative. On the contrary, and what's very positive about it is that it's an initiative that came from the countries of the region themselves. Because I have the feeling that with the Berlin process that has been launched by Germany in 2013. I mean, we actually had the Stability Pact for Southeast Europe in the 2000s, and then founding the Regional Cooperation Council in 2008, I think it was actually meant to give more ownership to the region on the regional cooperation. And I feel that in a way the Berlin process was also founded because this regional ownership did not really create a lot of impetus. So the EU member states, in particular Germany, France, actually took this back into hand. And now there's again a desire to actually pass the ownership again to the countries of the region. Yeah, I think you raise a very important point here. So this question of incentives and how to incentivize governments that do not want to conduct reforms actually to reform nevertheless. And so I think my answer is twofold. I think on the one hand, I think that you can actually with a very concrete accession perspective and I think that you can actually also instill changes, but I think also that if I were the EU, I would not be that sure that I only cooperate with the governments in the region. I think that the EU should really have a very broad network of cooperation, also with different aspects of civil society, and that when I mentioned before, for instance, accession funds, so money obviously is can be a good incentive and it can be a good driver of change. But the argument we always get when we propose to policymakers, for instance in Germany, that there would be a need to increase funds, that well, this would probably only strengthen a certain strongmen and their friends actually. So I think what could be a good incentive is to really increase the pre-accession funds, but at the same time to establish a very good mechanism on how these funds are actually distributed. So to make sure that it does not only go to the usual suspects. So this could definitely be one incentive, but personally I think that we would also need more pressure, and one part of this would be, for instance, for the EU to have a more transparent assessment system on the rule of law in the region, because the current country reports that we have, nobody understands them. So I mean, so basically the governments can go in front of the press and they can say, well, you know, we did a very good job again this year. So we would need actually rule of law assessments that are transparent, that are actually comparable for all the countries of the region, and that are actually seeing the wood for the trees, so to say. So that really give a comprehensive assessment on the rule of law. And then we would also need to communicate this directly to citizens, so that governments cannot only do cherry picking. So I think that every citizen in the region should somehow be able to really get information on whether the government has been doing a good job on EU integration this year or not. And currently, this is not the case. But I think I digressed a little bit from your initial question. Yeah. 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 Definitely, yeah, you're touching on a very, very important issue. And I think the wording that we use is very important. I mean, already this notion of the Western Balkans, and once you're prepared, once you're ready, you go from the Western Balkans to the European Union. So this is already very, very unfortunate, actually. Another thing I really don't understand is why the EU in its official declaration always uses the word European perspective. There's a European perspective for the Western Balkans. I mean, it needs to be an EU perspective because obviously they are in Europe. I think that the discourse now changed really 180 degrees. If you listen to Ursula von der Leyen, of course, in a very specific context of this conflict, who stands there and says, Ukraine is a part of Europe and we want them in. So it's a little bit like we have now discovered that what I said in the beginning of the presentation, that Europe is actually more than the European Union. And yeah, as you said, no one would ever question whether France or the Netherlands or Switzerland are a part of Europe. So on the narrative, obviously a tricky one, but I think I'd really opt for the classical narrative that Europe is a project of peace and a project of democracy. And I think we see this very clearly now. I mean, the Ukraine conflict, the annexation of Crimea, it was a consequence, or it followed the pro-European or pro-EU protests actually at the Maidan. So this is really this idea of a democratic Europe is an idea that is really seems dangerous to some people, and I think it's really something that European identity needs to build around. I mean, what is the European Union if it's not a community of democratic states? Yes, it's a good question. I think it would need to be the other way around, actually. So we would need first to Serbia, either, I mean, formal recognition is a question, but once Serbia can actually accept in one way or the other that Kosovo is an independent state, many other countries of the European Union would not have a reason anymore to not to recognize Kosovo, you know, because it has, the issue has been resolved. So I think that's the only way to go about this. Otherwise, I don't see Spain or Greece, for instance, with Cyprus recognizing Kosovo anytime soon, if it doesn't get a signal from Serbia that this is all right. Can you repeat the question? Sorry. Which mistake are you referring to? The accession negotiations, you mean? I think it's a very, very different situation because Turkey has never been that advanced in the accession negotiations, actually, and also the Turkish accession perspective has always been very contested. So there was a certain time window when EU member states agreed that Turkey should have this accession perspective, but it was not a consensus as we see it now with the Western Balkans. Though I said before that this consensus is also a fragile one, definitely. But I think there's good reasons for the EU actually not to advance accession negotiations with Serbia right now. So once with regard to the rule of law issues, and on the other hand, and this is something that Germany has stressed all the time, that actually it's impossible to take in, I mean, everything is possible, but it would be very difficult to take in a new member state that actually has such a comprehensive, unresolved conflict that would, I mean, then you can say bye-bye to Kosovo's accession perspective already, and it would really be detrimental to the EU's decision-making processes. Yes. I think so. I think it's a more serious perspective than all the countries joining en bloc. And thank you for adding the fourth dilemma actually to this evening. I think it's definitely more realistic because it might be easier to digest both for decision makers in the EU and also for the populations to have, you know, one country joining after the other, and also in terms of accession incentives. So, for instance, imagine if North Macedonia knew now we're sitting with Albania in one boat forever. So now with the opening of negotiations, that's the case, but then they can move at their own speed. Imagine that we tell Albania, you have to wait now until political leaders in Bosnia and Herzegovina have sorted out how the state can function. So So yeah, I see the problems this brings along. We would, I think, definitely need a solution that countries have a very firm commitment, as firmer than that of Croatia actually, that they are not able to block their neighbors. There needs to be some kind of exemption clause or something like that. I think. Or maybe though it's not on the horizon at the moment, but not to take decisions with unanimity that would also solve the problem. I didn't know. Thank you very much. Bueno.
Und die Frauke, die Dame hinter der Kamera, die kommt mit. Ja, der Rektor ist nicht da, also. So, sorry, wir sind ja, es hat länger gedauert, ja. So, wir hören jetzt auf.